If you want to start exports from India or move to another country, one of the fastest growing markets right now is Australia. Indian clothes, shoes, jewelry, food and beverage, they're all taking off in the continent, as is the need for Indian talent. Right from IT professionals to healthcare workers, everyone is invited. To understand this booming trade and migration, I decided to meet with the Australian High Commissioner in Delhi.
Hi, Commissioner.
Great to see you.
What a pleasure.
Thanks so much for joining us.
He was kind enough to host me at his home, and we discussed everything about how can someone start exports with Australia? How can talented Indians migrate to Australia? What should they study? We discuss Indian brands, food products, IT, rare earths, space tech, and some underrated places in Australia for you to visit. This is Founder's Office with Sarthak Ahuja. The trade between Australia and India has actually been fabulous after the two countries signed the Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, ECTA, and that happened towards the end of 2022.
Correct.
And I think it almost doubled the year after with almost 100% rise. And while a lot of this may happen on the back of, say, certain products like petroleum products and, engineering goods, but I do see a lot of growth even in sectors like apparel, fashion, gems and jewelry. So do you think there are certain niche areas where Australia would love to see a lot more categories being imported from India, or Indian business owners who build consumer products and you think could have a market in Australia that you guys are trying to develop?
Well, certainly. I mean, the growth has been phenomenal. When you look at the last 5 years, India's exports to the world have gone up about 40%, which sounds great, but India's exports to Australia have gone up by 200%. So Indian exporters are benefiting from Australia at a 5x advantage to the rest of the world. And ECTA has been part of that, but also the fact that both of our governments, for a range of reasons, have chosen to focus on each other. We're spending a lot of money, 280 million Australian dollars to upgrade the bilateral economic relationship between Australia and India. We've opened new consulates. I've got new trade people working in the field. Look, there is a fundamental complementarity between our economies. I mean, India's the fastest growing large economy in the world, so there isn't a place on earth that isn't taking notice of Indian growth. But Australia's in a great position because we are strategically aligned with India. We're a neighbour across the Indian Ocean, but because we produce the sort of things that India needs for the next phase of its economic growth and vice versa. So when I think about India's growth and the demand here for high quality energy, but also a middle class that is looking for premium and better foods, when I think about the 12 million Indian graduates who arrive on the market every year and need training, and the Australian universities that are now operational in India, I think there is great opportunity. And much the same is true for Indian exporters to Australia. So, we've already seen phenomenal growth in Indian tech firms in Australia. Firms like Wipro and HCL, investing hundreds of millions of dollars, making our businesses in Australia more profitable, more efficient, and driving jobs and capability for Indian firms. I think there's a lot more to that. And then it's interesting the niches that Indian firms are succeeding in. 100% increase in exports from India of automotive products since ECTA. 20% increase in agriculture products. And some of that is driven by the now more than 1 million people of Indian origin in Australia who are looking for Indian food products. But much of it is also driven by an Australian consumer who is keen to get products of the highest quality from all around the world. Jewelry, I think, is a huge opportunity. Indian watches, Indian beautiful fabrics. I mean, I'm a particular lover of Fab India. I'd love to see them more engaged in Australia. So look, I think the scene is set for an even greater growth in our trade and investment. And I think there are many opportunities for Indian investors and traders.
Wonderful. You've touched upon so many sectors. So, to go deeper, if an Indian business owner had to enter the Australian market, firstly, from the perspective of where the diaspora is at, would you have a ranking of cities where you think it's almost a no-brainer to say start off with like a Sydney, maybe follow that up with a Melbourne, then go to a Canberra or some other city? Is there something that I'm missing out there? Would you have a ranking that you would recommend how they should enter the Australian market?
Well, it depends a bit on the product, doesn't it? And it's not irrelevant to say that there are 1 million people of Indian origin, and you could look at Sydney or Melbourne where there are big opportunities, but there's 26 million people who aren't of Indian origin, and there's plenty of Indian products that will be wanted by a wide range of Australians. So, Sydney and Melbourne are our big metropolises. Brisbane, huge growth in the economy of southeast Queensland. Perth, a much smaller state, but Perth's about 11% of Australia's population and about 25% of Australia's wealth. So,
wow.
there's an opportunity off the back of huge mineral wealth in WA. And then you have states like South Australia that are becoming much more influential in defence and tech and healthcare. And so I think the answer to your question is it will depend a lot about the product or service that an Indian firm has. And the big mega cities of Sydney and Melbourne would be natural places for just about anyone to start, but there are plenty of other places that are worth a look.
Okay, so can you explain what is it that the ECTA has eased for traders between two countries and any success stories around it, so that could be inspiration for a lot of other business owners who so far did not look at the Australian market to now believe that, okay, because all of these things which were probably hindrances till about 3 years ago have now been removed, and that makes life easier for us?
Okay, so it's pretty simple, isn't it? 99% of Indian products enter Australia completely tariff and duty free, no asterisk, no questions, no issues. And that 99% figure will go to 100% at the end of next year. So absolutely everything produced in India come to Australia tariff and duty free. So, the Indian exporter is sophisticated. We share a language. We have a lot of cultural familiarity. Any Australian, any Indian can start a conversation in cricket, apart from anything else. So, I don't think there's a lot that stands in the way. In the early years of ECTA, we've seen big advances in automotive and apparel and food and beverage. But, when I think of India's phenomenal success in fields like healthcare, I think that there's going to be a real opportunity there. And the whole tech sector and environment here in India provides a huge amount of innovation, which will find a happy test bed in Australia. So I think there's a range of fields, but those three, apparel, automotive, and food and beverage, have been the market leaders.
So you mentioned there's automotive, healthcare, and F&B is where we've seen a lot of growth. Now, speaking of healthcare specifically, I think people's general belief is that there are a lot of paramedics and nurses who can possibly go from India to Australia, and there continues to be a demand for it. Apart from these two, do you see a lot more in healthcare that could go? Do you think there are healthcare or medical care equipment that could be exported, or are you looking at certain other categories within this industry?
For the longest time, Australia has benefited from very high quality Indian healthcare professionals, and I think there is a future in that as well, both for nursing, but also for aged care and fields like that. But of course, in New India is changing and developing, and it's not any longer just about individuals. It can be about technologies and capabilities. And when I look at high quality healthcare brands in this country, like Biocon or like Apollo, I sort of think there will be really big opportunity. We spend about 2.5% of GDP on research and development, and so I think that bringing together India's innovation and the massive capability here with Australia's interests in healthcare and preparedness to spend real money on R&D is a big opportunity.
Yeah. So in this category particularly, for example, what we've seen over the past couple of years is there are a number of startups that have come into India, and they are solely focused on taking a lot of nursing staff to certain other countries, specifically to Germany, Japan, and Italy. Do you think startups focused on Australia would do great for this market, for both Australia as well as India?
Well, I don't know about startups. I mean, what we are seeing is Australian education providers starting to provide courses in India, which will allow it to be more easy for Indian health professionals to make a start in Australia. And of course, we have a global non-discriminatory visa policy. So it's not like you need to have a particular leg up to make an application to come to Australia to live and study. For these other countries, they set aside quotas and numbers. We don't have that. Indian nurses, Indian doctors, Indian healthcare professionals can compete against anyone in the world and be part of our couple of 100,000 migration policy every year. So, and we're seeing obviously many pick up like that. I guess there is to some extent an industry around that flow of people, but equally individuals can do it on their own.
And when we speak of IT professionals, a lot of the IT services that Indians provide to, say, the Western world, we feel like could get severely impacted by AI, and we could see a massive, hit to the numbers going forward, which is why a lot of small and medium IT services professionals in India continue to feel we need to look at other markets like Africa maybe. So do you think there are certain opportunities in Australia? What is going to be the impact of AI, or do you see sectors within IT could continue to grow because of certain other reasons on how the Australia-India trade is happening in these services so far?
Well, I think a couple of things will happen. I mean, I think that some lower end jobs will be lost as a result of the power of AI, and we shouldn't underestimate that. But I think the other thing that will happen is that those who can help global firms, including firms in Australia, understand how to maximize the benefit from AI will have huge opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I think India is going to be at the leading edge of that. So I think there's big opportunity there. I mean, I know your viewers and listeners are very interested in the way in which the Australian market works. I mean, I think a key thing to understand about the Australian market is the massively high take-up by the Australian consumer and Australian business of IT services. So we're not a huge producer of IT services. We rely on a lot of countries like the United States, Japan, and now India on IT services. But in terms of the average Australian consuming IT services, it's at the zenith. So anyone who can find that niche where they're providing a service which is better or perhaps cheaper than another IT service provider is going to make very substantial gains in the Australian market.
This also brings me to education in a way that this presents an opportunity for people who have, say, IT colleges in India to possibly cater to a demographic within Australia as well, and maybe provide them education on IT. But at the same time, we're also seeing universities from Australia planning on setting up in India in 2026, right, which is a few months from now. So where do you think we could in India learn from certain skills in Australia that exist? What kind of people should sign up for Australian universities? Do you think it's only people who should eventually look at moving to the Australian market and provide services there, because certain other Western markets right now feel out of bounds for whatever reason? and that presents an opportunity for students to go there. Is that something that the Australian government looks at positively? And on the other end, what are things that we could learn from Australians which you think possibly lack as skills in India?
You know, and it's really interesting to see the number of high-level Indian entrepreneurs who've studied in Australia, understood the ecosystem there, and then returned with skills and the backing of the whole Indian environment to make a big impact in the bilateral trade. So, you know, Rajan Merchandani, he runs a major firm in Pune which deals both in green energy products, including car chargers, but also has brought technology from Australia that relates to speed cameras and keeping your roads safer. He's a classic example of somebody who went to Australia, built his skill base there, returned to India, and is now benefiting substantially from understanding both ecosystems. He also quite likes Australian wine.
Yeah. Is Australian wine something that you think still has potential in people kind of importing into India? Do you see that market growing?
We do. We absolutely do. Can't imagine a good Indian meal without a glass of South Australian dry white wine to go to take it down. But seriously, I mean, under ECTA, we got some remission from tariffs on Indian product. And by the way, the Australian wine industry is also providing support to the nascent wine industry, much of it around Nashik, which I've enjoyed with my wife going to see. So, look, the wine market here is small, but it's growing. And our producers are very focused on diversifying their exports. And so India is very much on their agenda as a country where we might be able to export some more wine. But also a place where we think that wine growing's got a future that the Australian industry is prepared to support.
So in the same vein, what all other Australian products would you love for people in India to kind of start consuming and appreciating? And the reason I ask this is we could also look at a lot of people actually importing a lot from Australia, be it agri-produce, be it certain brands, which could be value-added products, and create a market in India as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's going to be a lot of opportunities, and there's already firms like Canva, which are very engaged here in the tech sector, that are making waves. Look, you know, I think that Australian food products are going to go well here. We see that not only is the middle class swelling here, but we see that the taste for premium and something new is growing. And so products like Australian avocados, which are now coming in here. There are many other Australian products which are sort of counter-cyclical to the Indian agricultural scene, which means that we can supply at times when there's deficit from Indian production. And you know, there are lots of sweet tooths here in India. So Australian Tim Tams,
yeah.
If you don't know them, sort of lovely little crunchy chocolate squares or rectangles. I think Indians will love them. So a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, I've tried them. I think Tim Tams are just amazing. Yeah, would love to see them in India. Okay, with that, I also want to understand that, you know, how Australia and India are essentially ranked 3 and 4 in terms of rare earth reserves that these countries have. And that is becoming a big point of concern today because practically all of the refining is happening in China. And then, of course, even Brazil has a lot in terms of reserves. But now other countries, because they're planning on starting refineries, is that an opportunity that Australia is looking at actively, in the sense if one had to set up a refinery? Would you say that should happen as per current agreement terms in Australia or in India? And what do you think would be most beneficial for both countries put together?
I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And when you think about the fact that Australia is a major producer for lithium, for instance, Australia produces more than half of the world's lithium. India is going to be a major manufacturer of batteries and electric vehicles. And at the moment, the lithium-ion battery is the central technology associated with that. But at the moment, there's very little direct trade in lithium between Australia and India for reasons that you say. So I think there's two aspects to this. I mean, firstly, it's getting Indian firms access to quantities of Australian lithium, and that might mean offtake agreements with Australian firms, or it might mean joint ventures and some sort of equity arrangement. Either is possible. But then you're quite right to point to the supply chain of downstream processing, which frankly is hard. And we in Australia think there is a role for a level of downstream processing of lithium, for example, into lithium hydroxide, which can then be exported. And a country like India might then, pick up the supply chain, move to cathode active material, to cells and to batteries. So, we think there is a real prospect there of a supply chain which will benefit both countries and deliver economic benefit, as well as diversification and security of supply of materials and metals that at the moment are not particularly in fluid supply across the world. This is hard. Australia is a liberal economy, an open economy. We don't do things mostly by the way of government action. But in this field, we do have a critical minerals mission, which is designed to do just as you say and create new and more fluid supply chains across the world for these crucial minerals or metals for the new economy.
In the same vein, a lot of Western economies essentially don't want to set up rare earth refining facilities in their countries because they feel it'll kind of be counterproductive to their, climate motivations and climate targets that they're trying to achieve. And then when you think of setting up those factories or refining facilities in a country like China or in India, what really happens is because of the population density, the cost for pollution is much higher. Do you think Australia, being sparsely populated in a big chunk of the land where there is not too much population, would the country be open to, at some point, having refineries being set up in those places so that it doesn't really hamper with pollution, mostly in areas where there are large populations residing? And for someone who's looking to invest in Australia, do you think they would meet with friendly terms from the Australia government where, things like climate and pollution from these refineries would not come in the way for those investments to happen? Because that's going to be a very big question the moment someone decides to set up refineries and rare earths.
So, Sarthak, you're right to point to that, but it's probably not the way in which our government looks at it. The fundamental way in which we look at it is to say that we have quite a lot of these minerals and metals in our earth, and a fair bit of it is already mined. And our ambition is to go a little further up the beneficiation chain than we already are. Now, we understand that other countries, and India is a classic example, will have comparative advantage over us in some forms of manufacturing. But we want to get beyond being a country that just pulls it out of the ground and ships it up as rare as ore. So, yes, there are challenges to the processing of many of these commodities, but we're a global major when it comes to mining, and our companies are not neophytes when it comes to creating supply chains which can both work for the Australian environment as well as create value. So we're not afraid of that challenge. And you mentioned the climate issue. Of course, there's a growing market globally for green mined products, that is to say, products that are mined with little or no impact on fossil fuel emissions, and Australian firms are at the leading edge of responding to that. So fundamentally, our government's perspective is we want more, not less, beneficiation of minerals. And yes, there might be challenges to that, but we think that there are challenges that our country, with its technology, with some help from others, is at global class and able to meet.
Wonderful. We also see ISRO in India
Yeah.
do a lot in space research. And now the idea going forward, I would assume, would be that ISRO would want to provide a lot of these space mission related services to other countries, and they could come to India. And I believe that's already happening.
Absolutely.
Does Australia have a space mission of sorts where you think there could be a partnership here? And another reason I bring it up is not just from the perspective of the government and the ISRO, but right now we're seeing a lot of Indian tech entrepreneurs trying to build in space tech. And I think Australia as a market or a supporter could end up being a big market for them, because in India they would only look at supplying to maybe the ISRO. But if defense or something like that opens up in Australia, that would be amazing opportunity for Indian tech entrepreneurs to supply to.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because when I was at the Bangalore Space Summit just last year, the Australian delegation was, if not the largest, then one of the largest that came. And when I asked the Australian Industry Association where India ranked in their league table of countries to engage with, the answer was India ranked at the top. So what's causing this? A part of it is about, once again, complementary skills. You know, India's strength on launch and rocketry, and Australia's strength on what might go on in the payload of a rocket, and what sort of activities you might undertake. I mean, firms like Space Machines in Australia is the leading edge of this and is in close collaboration with India. Second thing is to say, we've had for some time now a grant mechanism that supports Australia-India collaboration at the level of the firm in space. From memory, I think that's about $18 million a year, so it's not peanuts. And the other factor is that our two space sectors are growing up together. In other countries, you have very mature space sectors. For both of us, space is a growing area of interest. In our case, our space sector is growing by more than 10% per annum. So we, as governments, we are committed to working together in space, and Australia has supported some of India's most important space assignments, including those first signals which came back from the south pole of the moon just a couple of years ago. Those were first tracked in Australia. So there's a very high level of collaboration in this field, and I think it's one of the real growth areas. You mentioned the associated field of defence, and that too is a field where we think there is going to be real opportunity for our collaboration, for reasons which I think all of us understand well. We're spending more money on defence, and we all need more support from countries which are strategically aligned with us, like India.
Yeah. You know, typically, whenever entrepreneurs think of where is it that I want to build a new business, what they evaluate in India is, of course, very naturally, where are the tailwinds, even from a regulatory standpoint? Where is it that the government will be putting a lot of money towards infrastructure and sector and industry development? So if someone had to look at an opportunity in Australia, what are the top 2 or 3 categories where the Australian government is really trying to push a lot, which is a tailwind that an Indian entrepreneur wanting to invest in Australia could ride and get massive opportunity of growth in? And are there any markets which are probably not as well developed as a Sydney or a Melbourne? You mentioned Perth, but you see a lot of growth happening in which could be underserved from a consumer perspective that one should focus on going after.
Well, a few things. We haven't yet talked about Indian tourism growth to Australia. I think there's real opportunity for Indian hospitality and food and beverage offerings in Australia, which will work also for Australian and other tourists, but also work for the Indian tourists. So we're working quite hard with some of your larger hospitality groups to find inroads there. In terms of fields which are really important to the Australian government at the moment, we have a policy called Future Made in Australia. We want more of our economy to benefit from the resources and energy, the plentiful resources and energy we have, but do more beneficiation in Australia. Now, that doesn't mean that Australia will try to produce everything and India is a country which has real comparative advantage in manufacturing. But I think Indian firms that can feed into a supply chain which takes Australia up the beneficiation curve will benefit. And there's one other that I really want to mention, because I want to mention the firm Perdaman, which is the chair is an Australian of Indian origin, and he is building a huge urea plant in Western Australia, towards the north of Western Australia. I think he's the first major Australian operation which is choosing to source his infrastructure from India. So massive pieces of ironwork and kit are being built in India, in Tamil Nadu and in Gujarat, and being shipped to Australia to form part of what is one of the biggest new projects in Australia. So, we've seen that sort of thing before from China and from Korea. It's the first time in Japan, first time we've seen it from India. I think it's a lead indicator of the comparative advantage between India's manufacturing strength and the need that Australia will have for major projects in fields of oil and gas and mining.
Wonderful. Are there any commodities that you think could be imported from Australia, which you think are currently not being imported into India to their full potential?
Oh, well, I think there's a lot that we can talk about there. I mean, the pathway that we've seen on avocados is a good one. And where I am looking is in agricultural products which are less for the mass market and more from the Indian middle class and premium market, where high quality and to some extent high cost Australian produce will find a way. Apples is a classic example. There's many horticultural items. I think the real benefit of this is that in very few cases will these compete with Indian produce. This will be at a different market segment. And I think across the gamut of agricultural products, you can see that happening. I mean, the other thing where I do see advantage is the bringing together the Australian innovation sector and India's manufacturing strength. So you think about it, Australia is a country which produces a lot more innovation than its position as the 12th or 13th biggest economy in the world warrants, or a population of only 27 million people. But we have a small market and we're not close to global supply chains. So good Australian ideas together with Indian manufacturing heft, I think, is a great partnership. So there's a really good example, TAV bikes, e-bikes. The idea comes out of Adelaide, which is where a lot of innovation is coming from Australia, and the bikes are now being made in Tamil Nadu. So that sort of collaboration between Australian and Indian industry, I think, has got a big future.
Yeah? Okay. And if purely for tourism, someone's planning a trip to Australia, where would you recommend? Is there an underrated place apart from Tasmania that you've mentioned which they should check out? Because most people would just end up going to Gold Coast and Sydney and Melbourne and be like, okay, I'm done with Australia.
I mean, there's lots of opportunities whether you want to go to the beaches of Queensland or experience the food and wine culture of Melbourne, or go and see wineries in South Australia. But I mean, the wide open plains of Western Australia, it's a third of our continent and only has 10 or 12% of our population. So there's an awful lot of open space there for Indians to enjoy. And as I said, when it comes to natural beauty in a relatively small confined space, Tasmania is just extraordinary.
Wonderful. Is there any other thing that you would want us to cover as part of this?
Oh, look, I think one thing we haven't talked about much, Sarthak, is the environment for business in Australia. I mean, We are one of the most open economies of the world. I think in terms of trade liberalisation, we're regarded as the second highest in the world. Ours is not an environment that is difficult for foreigners to navigate. And it's particularly easy for Indians because language and the fundamental systems of government are alike. So, I would urge Indian traders and investors to come and have a look. You will find a very vibrant interest in India. I found that when I went round Australia recently, from the Indian population of Australia, but much more broadly as well. People are conscious of India's growth and role in the world, are respectful of the way in which India is making its way as a great power. So there's interest in India. The acceleration of the economy here is very well known in Australia. And so our systems and regulations would make it relatively easy to set up businesses and do things in Australia. So I would strongly recommend that Indian traders and investors come and have a look in Australia. There's lots to see on the tourism trail, but also there's lots of really good business to do.
We're looking forward to enabling that, and hopefully in 2026 we'll probably inspire and get maybe hundreds of people to Australia, and that's our mission, that's our vision, and hopefully a lot more business between India and Australia.
You'll be incredibly welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, High Commissioner.
Thank you.
Our focus is to help you build a business that's not just big in India, but expands all over the world. If that interests you, do follow us on this channel and keep coming back for more Founders Office with Sarthak Ahuja.